All right, let's everyone take our seats. My name's Malcolm Rhodes. I'm the chairman of the Horseshoe Crab Management Board. To my immediate right is Dr. Mike Schmidtke, who is the ASMFC staffer in charge of this area. I want to welcome everyone here. Everyone should have gotten previous notes in the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? All right, seeing none, we'll take that as accepted, and we received the minutes from the last meeting. Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to correct the proceedings from the May meeting to show that Emerson Hasbrook was present as a board member. I'm not listed here under the attendance, but in the body of the minutes, there are my comments that are in there, so I was here.
Excellent. So noted. With that change, any others? Seeing none, we'll accept those. Are there any public comments on matters that are not coming before the board? There was no one signed up for it, so we'll move on to the fourth order of business. At the last meeting, Joe Simono ran it beautifully. We got through the 2019 Horseshoe Crab Benchmark Stock Assessment. It sounded like there's a lot of great discussion about what went on with that. Because of the length of those discussions and some salient points, the management response, certain parts of the management response had been touched on, but the board as a whole did not come up with any plans at that point. So that's where we are right now. At this point, I'm going to turn the meeting over to Mike, and we will move forward from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I don't have a lengthy presentation. It really is just one slide, and it's a reminder of some of the points that were brought up at the last meeting after going through the benchmark stock assessment. These were some of the potential responses based off of the information from the assessment itself, as well as some actions that were delayed prior to the assessment taking place. First of all, incorporation of the catch survey analysis population estimates into the ARM model. That direction was given by the board, and that process is underway. The ARM subcommittee and the Delaware Bay Technical Committee will be meeting in person in September to discuss exactly how this will take place, as well as how to present this information to the public, taking into account all of the aspects of that estimate related to confidentiality of biomedical information. The next point had to do with management changes in the New York region, if the board would want any to be made. The New York region, as a reminder, was given a poor status by the stock assessment. This status reflected declining indices in that region. Nearly all of the indices that were looked at from the New York region were declining. As a reminder to the board, there's this poor status, but it's not the same thing as overfishing necessarily, because an overfishing threshold has not been established for this population. In addition, the quotas that have been established for the states have not been exceeded for New York and Connecticut during that time. So it's not necessarily the same thing as overfishing, but it is a poor status that indicates a declining population in that area. The next part is draft addendum 8, which was postponed. The plan initially is to take this up at the October 2019 meeting, when there's a bit more time for discussion if that's necessary. And finally, if the board wants to consider any form of a review to the ARM model. The most recent ARM review was conducted in 2016, and that was a short-term review. Addendum 7 defines a long-term review that could be conducted of the ARM model. That has not been done since the ARM management framework has been put into place. So if the board wanted to consider that, that is a direction you all could go, but with the knowledge that there would need to be a significant investment of time and/or commission funds in order to make something like that happen. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you for that synopsis and kind of an idea of where we're going. In the intervening time, I know the New York region has had several visits. We've had some phone conferences. And at this point, if y'all are ready, would New York or Connecticut have any state responses they'd like to put before the board?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me, I'll talk, we've been talking with Connecticut, but let me give a little background on this so it's what we understand is going on. So New York's harvest quota is 360,000 crabs a year. We reduced that several years ago, first down to about 175,000. We've gone down to 150,000. So we've done about a 60% reduction in our harvest quota. In addition to that, we've incorporated significant monitoring. We have trip limits. We have essentially adjustments to those trip limits quite frequently during the year. And in fact, I just closed the fishery last week, so there will be no fall fishery this year. So we're getting to the point right now that the problem of trying to continue to reduce harvest in New York is really probably not at the root of what the problem is. And and one thing, and I've stated this before at this board, was, well, let me say it more generically, because I do teach fisheries management. Moratoriums on healthy species is the worst thing you can do, because this is the problem it creates. When the moratorium was put into New Jersey, and I'm not faulting Jersey because it was done by their legislature, so the other reason is why we never want legislatures to manage fisheries is because they create problems like this. When the crabs were essentially open in both states, they were going for about 25 cents a pound. When the fishery was closed in Jersey, they shot up to about $3 a pound. And anybody that knows this fishery, you get a pickup truck and a refrigerator, and you're in the fishery. So we had quite a significant amount of poaching. We increased our law enforcement activities. In fact, we were doing coordination with some of the county helicopters to catch these guys, but it's just such a big fishery, and it's such a good way to make profit. So that all being said, we're looking at ways to do additional management, and the first thing that we can add on at this point is that we're essentially going to go what Jersey is already doing and require bait bags, and see if that can essentially reduce the amount of harvest that we're going to need. We are looking at some possible closures, but we don't really, know how to do that yet, particularly around the big spawning period. So we're working on that right now, and our preference, obviously, is to do this as a, just a state action without having to do an addendum, so everyone has to do a lot of work. But again, I'm not optimistic that anything we do at this point is going to help until we get a better sense of how to manage this fishery with a moratorium in it. I've talked to Jersey, and again, they understand this is a legislative action, and they've done things to try to help out, but I'm not sure if there's other things they do, and I'll let them talk to that. But the data, when we've dissected a little bit, it's very, very clear. It's the closer you get to the western part of Long Island in towards New Jersey, is the numbers get worse. So it's clearly that action that was done by their legislature is having an effect on the population. So my final statement, and I'll give it over to Justin to add into it, is that the action that the Jersey legislature did exactly the opposite of what what we needed to do, and it's having a negative effect on the population. Maybe in Delaware Bay it's helping them, in terms of keeping the population up, but on the entire regional area right now it's having a detriment. So I'll turn it over to Justin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Just
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I think my remarks will largely mirror a lot of what Jim just said. We don't share a border with New Jersey, so we don't necessarily have the same concerns relative to that and the moratorium in New Jersey, but we do, I guess, sort of feel that our fishery and imposing further restrictions on our fishery is probably not going to produce a significant effect on the horseshoe crab population. We have a very small scale fishery. It's really about a dozen fishermen participating in the fishery. Our harvest has been constant at about half of our quota for a number of years now. That being said, we also would prefer to approach this from a state level action. We have begun taking a look at measures that might potentially reduce harvest, such as reducing possession limits or reducing the amount of time that we're open. We are open for a pretty restricted period as is. We're open for about 6 weeks, and we're closed on the weekends during that period, so we already have a very short season. So we've begun taking a look at potential measures that might help reduce harvest. We would approach that through our state regulatory process, which could take anywhere from 6 months to a year, depending on how lucky we get and how the chips fall out. So that's where we're at right now in Connecticut. We're starting to take a look at measures that might reduce harvest and hope over the next year to continue those discussions and move on a regulatory process to address it. I will also say that we're working in conjunction with New York on developing regulations for the whelk fishery in Long Island Sound. So we would also be looking to mandate bait bags in that fishery and hopefully reduce the amount of bait required.
Thank you all both very much. I'll open it up to the rest of the board for any questions or thoughts or concerns. Chris.
Jim, when you closed the fishery this year, how much harvest was there at that point?
I don't know the exact number, but it was around the 150,000. I think we might have been slightly over, but it's shut down now.
Dan?
Yeah, for the record, Massachusetts adopted the Rhode Island lunar closures about 10 years ago, and we think that this has had a real positive impact on recruitment. And then it was originally just May and June, and we even backed it up into April. So for the better part of 10 weeks, we don't allow any harvest over a 5-day period of the new and full moons.
Thank you very much. Stuart?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Jim, that 150,000 horseshoe crab cap, is that, I guess, several questions. One, is that sex specific at all? And then the other one is that in regulation, or is that just kind of an administrative policy of yours? And are there mandatory paybacks?
Let me take them one at a time. It's not a sex fishery because in New York we have it's different than Delaware Bay. It's pretty much a 50-50 split, so a male-only fishery would make no sense. It's essentially not, those numbers are not specifically in regulation, but the ability to manage it is, and that we've had great success keeping it around that 150. I think one year it got a little bit ahead of us, and we went up to 170,000, but we've generally stayed at that 150,000. And sorry, the last one, Stu, was there's no payback provision in it, whatever. And I will add that Justin had said about the bait bags. We've already put a rulemaking in place to implement those in New York, so that's already in process. Thanks.
Thank you. Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to address some of Jim's comments, and as you mentioned, there was a conference call with Connecticut and New York. New Jersey sat in on that. New Jersey does require bait bags in the whelk fishery. They also require receipts. Anyone that is using horseshoe crab as bait needs to have receipts. I spoke to our law enforcement division, and they said in both of those instances on their stops, there's really good compliance, especially for the bait bags, since, as Jim mentioned, these crabs are quite expensive. So, the other thing that they noted was that, in general, these guys are already using less than a horseshoe crab, or whatever they feel is effective. And so I don't know what else New Jersey can do. On that conference call, the only other suggestion was consideration of alternative baits, but I think this board is very familiar with that, and doesn't seem like a viable option at this time. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Dan?
Yeah, what we've discovered in Massachusetts is a lot of the whelk potters were using green crabs. The legislature had put a bounty on green crabs with funding that we distributed to the towns to remove invasive green crabs, and those became one of the bait components. So a lot of our whelk fishermen are using a kind of a buffet of baits, a piece of horseshoe crab, some green crabs, a dogfish head, a herring. Some guys use mussels. So we've sort of evolved that. We think our use of horseshoe crabs is down because of that.
Thank you. Great to have very non-selective snails. Any other people want to address? Seeing that, I guess the board at this point has to decide what sort of response. If our choices will be looking at the measures the two states have implemented and follow up with them, or do we want to have something more statutory from the board? And I'm going to turn that over to the board. Bob?
I'll take the bait, Mr. Chair. I feel comfortable allowing New York and Connecticut initiate state action, tracking that action. I think it's incumbent upon the board to track that action and to continue tracking the monitoring trawl survey results to see if there is any cause and effect. And I would be comfortable with that approach. Thank you.
Any further? Is everyone comfortable with that approach? Seeing no Tony?
There's no objection. I think that if we can make the timing work out, we can provide that report to the board when we do our annual compliance reports, and I can work with Jim and Justin and Mike to see if that would line up well to have an annual tracking of those measures.
Fantastic. Thank you. Dan?
I have a question. Is it New York and Connecticut's intent to have rules in place by next spring?
Yeah, New York is, like I said, the bait bag issue is already in our rulemaking process, and then if we are going to do the additional measures, like I said, we're considering some sort of a seasonal closure. We have a order that we're doing. We're trying to do whelk and this at the same time. So, yeah, the whole idea would be to have this in place for the next year. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm cautiously optimistic that Connecticut might be able to have rules in place by spring 2020 as well.
Fantastic. Other responses from the report were Addendum 8, which specifically deals with 2 points. One is accounting for the mortality from biomedical harvest, and then for possible female horseshoe crab harvest in Delaware Bay when certain triggers are hit. Does anyone have any feel for either of those at this point?
And so we don't need to necessarily address Addendum 8 within this meeting here. Like it's on the screen, it can be taken up at the 2019 meeting, but just to give some background on the points that Mr. Chair just brought up, for the biomedical incorporation of the biomedical mortality, there were a couple of different looks at this from the ARM subcommittee. Both indicated that whether biomedical mortality is incorporated or not incorporated into the ARM model, and regardless of which way it's incorporated, of reducing the harvest packages or adding it as a mortality term in the model itself, it has not changed the results. It would not have changed any of the results from the harvest packages that were produced from that model. in looking at kind of an additional point from the stock assessment in looking at how the catch survey analysis population estimates are going to be incorporated into the ARM model, if the best population estimate from that analysis is used in the ARM model, then that would incorporate biomedical information inherently from that estimate, because it would be there as part of the model. One of the tricky parts and one of the things that the ARM subcommittee and Delaware Bay TC would need to discuss is how that information could be incorporated and conveyed in some way publicly so that can be used in management. And that's something that will be taken up at that September meeting. On the points of the harvest packages and the potential for female harvest in the Delaware Bay, that's something that was looked at a few times in the interim as well. And the bottom line of it is that unless the horseshoe crab females or the red knots hit their population thresholds, no matter how many additional packages get put into the mix, there will be no female harvest unless those thresholds get exceeded. So that's kind of the takeaways of some of the analysis that has been done since draft addendum 8 was initiated, and then to the point that we currently are, since it was postponed and potentially being taken back up in October.
Any questions? Is everyone comfortable with that? And Stu?
I'm sorry. So the question as to whether the catch survey model should be incorporated into the ARM process is going to be, that's going to happen in September?
It's kind of already a work in progress. Like, we're planning the meeting right now, but the meeting will occur in September for the subcommittee and the TC to discuss exactly how to do that and how to present that information for the board.
All right. Is everyone comfortable with where we are right now with the response and where we're moving forward? Chris?
In the peer review of the stock assessment, the chair specifically mentioned that the bycatch really needs to be addressed, and he suggested that the board figure out a way of getting to that number. It seems like the significance that he stressed in his report was pretty alarming to me. And I think we need to discuss that and figure out how do we get to those numbers so we can make better decisions in the future.
Okay. Is the board comfortable if we task the TC to look at that as they go over this data and see if they can come up with a way of modeling that into it? Roy?
Mr. Chairman, what would be the assignment? To examine the discard mortality rate or to suggest ways to reduce the discard mortality rate? Which is it?
I think at this point it's going to be trying to get a number for the discard mortality rate before we can affect it. It would be having a number that they're comfortable with that we can use for our analyses.
I think one point that would need to be considered with that, as far as like the timeline that the TC would be working with and the possibility of completing the task, is the access to the data. Somebody that is involved in the TC would need to be able to have access to the Northeast Fishery Observer Program data, because that was the primary data from which the discards were estimated in the assessment. And one of the big difficulties of why those estimates were so broad and not as well defined as we maybe would have liked them to be, was because there wasn't anybody on the SAS that had ready access to those data.
But
just for some clarification, as part of the stock assessment, we did use the Northeast Science Fishery Center's data to do bycatch estimates. There were a lot of comments during the peer review that they thought that some of those methods could be refined to be better, and that it would take some work and some collaboration with the Northeast Fishery Science Center. So I think certainly the TC could examine, maybe at a state level, and make some suggestions about what they think the mortality rates are for each of the gears that could be encountering horseshoe crabs. But as far as the methods and the analysis of the data, that's going to be a partnership really with the Northeast Science the Fisheries Science Center to kind of work together to get that data to be in better shape for a similar analysis.
okay. Well, that's Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question for Mike or maybe Kristen. Jumping to the last bullet, if we were to, at some meeting, go down the long-term ARM review, my understanding is that all the fundamental parts of the ARM would be reassessed and open to change, including those thresholds that Mike, you just spoke about. That we can have all the harvest packages we want, but based on where the thresholds are right now, it might not. You're not going to open up female harvest. But if we go into the long-term review, are those thresholds also open for reassessment?
I need 1 second just to check the language of the addendum and make sure.
Okay, sorry. So if I remember correctly, and I did not go back and double check the document, but the thresholds in the document were based on some scientific information that were provided to us. So yes, we could go back and review scientific information and change the thresholds, but it would still be based on scientific information. So it would, I think, whether or not those would change much is if the information that backed them changed. So if there hasn't been much change in the information that is source for that threshold, then probably not much change would occur. But through the addendum process, if you change the entire ARM modeling, then we would go through the addendum to do that. Does that make sense, Mike?
Yes, thanks. I'm just reflecting that those were created 10 years ago or more, I think. So maybe some things have changed.
Very good point. Any Stu?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that, or among the things that have changed are some of the surveys that are being used to provide those estimates of just exactly where we are relative to those utility functions. So it might be a good time to kind of take a shot at that long-term ARM review.
Right. Well, those are good points. I know the ARM working group is going to meet in September, and although they're not set up to go all of that, I'm sure the discussion will work towards that, and there may be some clear answers for everybody. Is there any other business to come before this board? Yes, sir.
I'm sorry. So are we going to charge the TC then with investigating some of these issues, like the bycatch and digging a little bit deeper into that? One of the issues I'm a little concerned with are the conversion factors that have been applied to along the coast. And if we could drill down on that, I think it would be helpful.
Those have all been noted and will be looked at. Any other business? All right, and Mike has one more bit.
So just giving the board an update, when the initial agenda went out, it did include an item for the FMP review, and we typically try to do that within a meeting or two of when the compliance reports are due. That is delayed this year. We have not received all of the compliance reports yet, but we are hoping to have all of the data that we need to conduct the FMP review in October. So just wanted to let the board know.
Great. If there's no other business, then we can stand adjourned, and we're back on time. Thank y'all.
We'll start the Menhaden board at 3:45.